32 of Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken, and we're jumping in at page 315. In chapter 31, we got to the end of World War II, and so the prisoners of war all realized that the bombs that were dropped, that was real. It was the atomic bombs, and the kill-all order does not go through. There are American pilots who come and drop candy and cigarettes for the men. And so they're still in the camp when we last left off, but they're celebrating because it's the end of the war. And so this next chapter is called Cascades of Pink Peaches. On August 22nd, Phil and Fred Garrett sat in the Rokushuri POW camp, wondering what was happening. Isolated on their chilly mountain, the POWs had been told nothing of momentous events of recent days. All they knew was that the camp commander had been gone for 5 days, and in his absence, the guards had been leading the POWs on ominous walks through the forest. So in Louie's camp, they know it's happening and that it's the end of the war, but in Phil's camp, they have no idea what's going on. That afternoon, the Japanese commander slogged back up the mountain looking wilted. He walked into the barracks and approached the ranking American, Lieutenant Colonel Marion Unra. "The Emperor has brought peace to the world," he said. The commander surrendered his sword to Unra, who gathered his men and told them that the war was over. The POWs immediately gathered for a Thanksgiving service. They were told that they must not seek revenge. They were officers and gentlemen, and they were to behave that way. The POWs promptly threw a party to end all parties. They demolished the camp fence and built a gigantic pile of wood, described by one POW as 50 feet tall. They asked the Japanese interpreter if he could get them sake, which is alcohol, and a barrel full of it soon arrived. The men jacked the lid off the barrel. Imbibing began, or drinking. The pile of wood was set on fire, and an Alabaman transformed a huge can into a drum, and inebriated or drunken men began dancing. A conga line of crazy drunk POWs wrapped around the camp and through the barracks, and one partier did a striptease, flinging off his clothes to reveal an emphatically unattractive body. The revelry, which went on all night, was so riotous, so like the partying was so loud and crazy, that one man marveled. He was amazed at the fact that all the POWs were still alive when the sun came up. And right here you can see, not necessarily at the same camp, but it says POWs celebrate the war's end. So they're just having this big old party as soon as they find out what happens. The following day, the hungover POWs walked down the mountain to the nearest villages. They found mostly ghost towns. The civilians had seen the bonfire, abandoned their homes, and fled. The POWs hiked back up and waited for help to come. So they can leave, the guards are letting them go, but they have no way to get home, so they just have to wait for help. At Noetsu, most of the guards stayed in camp, their haughtiness replaced by gushing obsequiousness. So they're really sorry, and they're going to try and make nice with the prisoners. There was almost no food and no tobacco. Fitzgerald went to the Japanese commander 3 times a day to demand more food and was rejected each time. POWs left camp in search of something to eat. Someone came back with a cow. Someone else herded in pigs. It wasn't enough. Fitzgerald wrote a dispatch to the Swiss consul in Tokyo, telling of the terrible conditions in camp and asking for immediate help. But the Japanese commander refused to send it. Livid, Fitzgerald threatened to inform the American forces about the commander's behavior, but the commander still refused. At about 10 in the morning on August 26, 6 days after the war's end was announced in Noetsu, Fitzgerald was just stepping out of the commander's office when a crowd of American fighter planes sent from the carrier Lexington shot overhead and began circling. The POWs charged outside yelling. They hastily cleared an area, fetched some white lime, and painted 2 giant words on the ground: "Food smokes." Messages dropped from the cockpits. The planes had been hauling emergency supplies to POW camps, but had exhausted their loads. I should read that. Food smokes, not food smoke. Sorry. They're saying that they want food and they want cigarettes. The pilots promised this food would soon come. Unable to feed the POWs, the pilots did the next best thing, putting on a 30-minute air show while the prisoners shouted their approval. Fitzgerald stood among his men, moved by their joyful, upturned faces. Wonderful, wrote J.O. Young in his diary, to stand cheering, crying, waving your hat, and acting like a damn fool in general. No one knows who has not spent all but 16 days of this war in a nipped prisoner can really know what it means to see old Sammy buzzing around over the camp. The fighters had a persuasive effect on the Japanese commander. He called for Fitzgerald, complained that Fitzgerald had not behaved like a gentleman, and accused him of bluffing when he had threatened to tell the American forces about him. I meant every word I said, Fitzgerald replied. 90 minutes later, Japanese trucks drove into camp, and out came rations, biscuits, and canned fruit. So this Fitzgerald is saying, if you don't get us food, we're going to report you to, the authorities, so that these people will be accused of war crimes for their treatment of the prisoners of war. And what do you know? They find food. That afternoon, more planes from Lexington flew over, and sea bags began thumping down all over camp. The POWs ran for their lives. One man, leaping from a fence to avoid getting clobbered, broke his ankle. One bag missed the camp altogether, splashing down in the river. The POWs ventured out, tore into the bags, and split up the loot. Each man received half a tin of tangerines, 1 pack of hardtack, 2 cigarettes, and a bit of candy. Someone waded into the river to grab the errant bag, and in it found magazines and a newspaper. Concerned that the food dropped wasn't nearly adequate, Fitzgerald told someone to write 700 PWS here on the ground. So they wanted to know there's 700 prisoners so that they know to send more food. As the men ate, they passed around the magazines and peeled through the soaked pages. The fighting, they learned, had ended on August 15th. The small voice that Wade had heard on the radio in the guardroom that day had been that of Emperor Hirohito, announcing the cessation or the stopping of hostilities. This meant that for 5 days, 7 in the case of Rokoroshi, the Japanese had deceived the POWs to hide the fact that the war was over. So the war's been over, but the POWs were still forced to live as if it weren't. Given all the signs that a massacre had been imminent, or destined to happen, definitely going to happen, it seemed likely that the commanders had been awaiting instruction on whether or not to carry it out, and had wanted to keep the men docile in case the answer was affirmative, in case it was a yes. 3 days after the fighters flew over, the Americans sent in the big boys. 6 B-29s, the words "Food for POWs" scrawled down the wing of one of them. The bomb bay doors parted and pallets poured out, swinging under red, white, and blue parachutes. The first load hit the compound. Others fell over the rice paddies, pursued by hundreds of gleeful living skeletons. One canister bore a message written in chalk: "Bombed here in May 45. Sorry I missed. Billy the Kid, Rhode Island, New York." Boxes fell all over the landscape. Some civilians pulled them into their homes and hid them. Others, though in great hardship themselves, dragged them into camp. The cargo banged down and boxes broke open. Cascades of pink peaches spilled over the countryside. A vegetable crate exploded, and the sky rained peas. A box dragged down the power lines in Nuetsu. Another harpooned the guardhouse, or stabbed the guardhouse with a food box. Louie and Tinker just missed being totaled by a giant drum full of shoes that they never saw coming. It shot through the banjo roof, landing on an unfortunate Australian whose leg was broken, and a Yank from Idaho, whose skull was fractured, fortunately not fatally. The Idahoan had been fasting all day in hopes that care packages would begin falling and he could gorge himself on American food instead of seaweed, meaning he hadn't eaten all day because he wanted to eat American food. He didn't want any more seaweed. To prevent further disaster, someone ran onto the road and wrote "Drop here." So they don't want it to get dropped on them. They would like the packages to be dropped on the road. An orgy of eating and smoking commenced. Men crammed their stomachs full, then had seconds and thirds. Louis opened a can of condensed split pea soup and shoveled it into his mouth, too hungry to add water. J.O. Young and 2 friends drank 2 gallons of cocoa. The food kept falling. So much of it showered down that Fitzgerald asked a man to go out on the road and make sure that whoever had written 700 POWs here hadn't accidentally added a 0, because they're going to give enough food for 7,000. At nightfall, the eating stopped. Men upended by swollen stomachs drifted off to sleep with no air raids, no tankos, no bird. Louis lay among them, swathed in an American parachute that he had dragged in from the rice paddy. "'Tis about 6 p.m., and I'm lying here in blissful misery, just as all POWs have sat around and dreamed about throughout this internment. In short, so full of chow that it's hard to even breathe." J.O. Young wrote in his diary, "As for your prisoners, there is no such thing as being satisfied after eating. You either don't have enough, or, as we are all now so darn full, you're in misery." So they've just stuffed themselves. You can see here it says photograph of the Noetsu compound taken by a rescue plane just after the war ends. The POWs had written messages for the pilots on the barracks roofs. So this says, "Enough thanks, PW, PW, any news?" So this is how they're communicating with planes. "There's just one thing left to say as we bunk down for the night," he continued, "and that it's wonderful to be Americans and free men, and it's a mite hard job even now to realize we're free men." On the morning of September 2nd, a B-29 known as Ghost Ship traced the long thread of beach marking the coast of western Japan. The plane had earned its moniker when an air traffic controller, unable to see 5-foot 7-inch pilot Byron Kinney in the cockpit, had exclaimed, "There's nobody in that plane. It must be a ghost ship." So the pilot's so short they thought that there was no pilot. In a briefing on Guam the afternoon before, Kinney had been told that he'd be carrying supplies to a remote POW camp called Noetsu. Louis was in the compound alone when Ghost Ship dipped under the clouds, skimmed the rice paddy, dropped its first load, and began a long circle for a second drop. Hearing the bomber, sleepy men shuffled out of the barracks and began running into the drop zone. Louis saw the plane coming back and began trying to alert the men. As he descended, Kinney saw POWs scattered over the paddy looking dirty, ragged, and haggard, and a lone man trying to pull them back. He abandoned the drop and circled again. By the time he returned, Louis had cleared the paddy. The second drop rolled out. Kinney turned the plane again, descended very low over camp, and dipped his wings. Louis stood under him in a crowd of POWs waving his shirt. Kinney was so low that he and Louis saw each other's smiling faces. "We could almost hear their cheers as we passed over the last time," Kinney wrote. "They looked so happy. It touched my heart. I felt perhaps we were the hand of Providence reaching out to those men. I was very thankful I had gone." As Ghost Ship sailed off, one of Kinney's crewmen piped the radio over the interphone. On came General Douglas MacArthur's voice, broadcasting from the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Standing with MacArthur was Bill Harris. He'd been rescued from a Mori and brought to the ship to occupy a place of honor. Alongside the Americans stood Japanese officials there to sign surrender documents. In its rampage over the East, Japan had brought atrocity and death on a scale that staggers the imagination. In the midst of it were the prisoners of war. Japan held some 132,000 POWs from America, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Holland, and Australia. Of those, we'll come back to this picture, nearly 36,000 died, more than one in every 4. Americans fared particularly badly. Of the 34,648 Americans held by Japan, 12,935, more than 37%, died. By comparison, only 1% of Americans held by the Nazis and Italians died. Japan murdered thousands of POWs on death marches and worked thousands of others to death in slavery, including some 16,000 POWs who died alongside as many as 100,000 Asian laborers forced to build the Burma-Siam Railway. Thousands of other POWs were beaten, burned, stabbed, or clubbed to death, shot, beheaded, killed during medical experiments, or eaten alive in ritual acts of cannibalism. And as a result of being fed grossly inadequate and befouled food and water, so not having enough food and also eating spoiled food, thousands more died of starvation and easily preventable diseases. Of the 2,500 POWs at Borneo's Sandakan camp, only 6, all escapees, made it to September 1945 alive. Left out of the numbing statistics are untold numbers of men who were captured and killed on the spot, or dragged to places like Kwajalein to be murdered without the world ever learning their fate. In accordance with the kill-all order, the Japanese massacred all 5,000 Korean captives on Tinian, all of the POWs on Balel Wake and Tarawa, and all but 11 POWs at Palawan. They were evidently about to murder all the other POWs and civilian internees in their custody when the atomic bomb brought their empire crashing down. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed its formal surrender. The Second World War was over. And on that really grim note, let's flip back to this picture. It says in the caption, at a Japanese POW camp, this dead American was found near war's end, still standing at a sink at which he was trying to drink. American soldiers and guerrillas went behind enemy lines to rescue the men at this camp, but they were too late. They found the bodies of 150 POWs starved to death. And you can just see, it's a really horrible picture. This man's legs are just, skin and bones. And so there's kind of this dichotomy or this juxtaposition that shows us that the war's over and they're celebrating. We're just talking about the party and it's raining peaches from the sky, but also this really harsh reality that these men have been tortured and people were murdered and starved. And so there's some excitement and celebration at the war ending, but also this really terrible reality of what has just taken place. For Louis, these were days of bliss. Though he was still sick, wasted, and weak, he glowed with euphoria, extreme happiness, such as he had never experienced. His rage against his captors was gone. Like all the men around him, he felt flushed with love for everyone and everything. Only the thought of the bird gave him pause. A few days earlier, Louis would have bound and killed him without remorse. Now the vengeful urge, or that urge to get revenge, no longer had sure footing. The bird was gone, his ability to reach Louis, physically at least, extinguished. At that moment, all Louis felt was rapture. So he's just so happy that the war's over. Forgiveness coursed through all of the men at Noetsu. POWs doled out supplies to civilians and stood in circles of children handing out chocolate. Okay, so pause here for 1 second. The prisoners are taking their supplies as they've been starved for months, and they're passing it out to other Japanese civilians. As they're talking about forgiveness coursing through the prisoners, this is really powerful and really remarkable because these men have just been degraded and dehumanized. They've been mistreated. They've been starved. But as soon as they have their freedom back, they just decide, for a lot of them, we're going to forgive these people and we're going to share what we have. And so that's a pretty cool moment. Louis and other POWs brought food and clothing to the guards and asked them to take it home to their families. Even Kono was spared. Ordered to stay in camp, he holed up in his office for 11 days, so afraid of retribution or payback that he never once came out. When a POW opened the door, Kono gasped and ran to a corner. A few days before, he might have met with reprisal, but today, there was no such spirit. The POWs left him alone. There was only one act of vengeance in the camp. When a particularly hated guard appeared in the galley or the kitchen, a POW grabbed him by the collar and the seat of his pants and threw him out the door with such force that he sailed over the riverside drop-off and into the Hokura River. The POWs never saw him again. The pallets didn't stop falling. After a few days of B-29 visits, food, medicine, and clothing were piling up everywhere. The officers distributed the food as soon as it landed, and every man was entombed in goodies. Eventually, someone climbed on the roofs and wrote, "No more. Thanks. Any news?" Gorging brought consequences. So that means just eating so much till you're sick. Digestive systems that had spent years scraping by on 2 or 3 cups of seaweed per day were overwhelmed. Noetsu became a festival of rapid-fire diarrhea. The benjo lines wound everywhere, and men unable to wait began dropping their pants and fertilizing Japan wherever the spirit moved them. Then they went right back to happy feasting. So they've been starving forever, right? They're not going to stop eating just because they're sick. They're going to eat it all. All over Japan, B-29s continued pouring food down on POWs. More than 1,000 planes saturated the landscape with nearly 4,500 tons of spam and fruit cocktail, soup, chocolate, medicine, clothing, and countless other treasures. At Amori, Bob Martindale had taken over the hateful little office where the bird had sat before his picture window, hunting men. He was there when an enormous box sailed out of the sun, hit the ground just outside the window, and exploded, obliterating the bird's office in a cataclysm of American cocoa powder. Martindale stumbled out kicked head to toe in cocoa, but otherwise uninjured. Everyone in camp was eager to get home, but radio messages sent out by the occupying forces stated that POWs should remain in camps for the time being. Fitzgerald was told that an evacuation team would come to Nuetzu on September 4th to oversee the POWs' transport to Yokohama and then home. So the POWs settled in to wait, eating, smoking, resting, eating, celebrating, swimming, and eating more. Louis ate voraciously, like he couldn't get enough. He kept eating. He got stronger and expanded exponentially, his face and body bloating from water retention. Louis did his best to clean himself up, starting with his muslin shirt, which he'd worn every day since the morning he had climbed into Green Hornet. So this is the same shirt he wore when he got on the plane before the crash. A beloved brother to him, it was torn, faded, and stained with coal dust, and Louis's handwritten name was now nearly invisible on its breast pocket. Louis boiled it in a pot to kill the lice and fleas, then scrubbed it to get the coal out. POWs fanned out over the countryside. Men carried airdropped items into town where they met cautiously friendly civilians and traded their goods for shaves, haircuts, and souvenirs. They knocked on doors, offering to trade airdrop food and tobacco for fresher fare. Inside the houses, they saw large industrial machines, just as Louis had seen in the ruins of Tokyo. Tinker found a Victrola in camp, like a music player, then went to town and bought a gift for Louis, a recording of Gustave Charpentier's Impressions d'Italie. The POWs, because remember they had talked all about Italy and Italian food, and he knows Louis Italian. The POWs broke into the storehouse and found some 1,500 Red Cross boxes. Several men discovered a brothel and came back to camp with sinners' grins. Ken Marvin and a friend borrowed kids' bikes and pedaled the roads, discovering what a beautiful place they'd been in all this time. Coming upon a public bath full of civilians, Marvin jumped right in with them, scrubbing himself clean for the first time since his last shower on Wake Atoll in December 1941. My God, he remembered just like a smorgasbord. September 4th arrived. The evacuation team never showed up. More than 2 weeks had passed since the TBF had flown over the river and blinked out the message that the war was over, and Commander Fitzgerald, like all the men in the camp, was sick of waiting. He asked Marvin and another man to don MP badges and walk with him to the train station. When they got there, Fitzgerald asked a Japanese station official to arrange for a 10-carriage train to be there the next day. The official refused and was plenty obnoxious about it. Commander John Fitzgerald had been in Japanese custody since April 1943. Remember, it's now September 1945. For 2.5 years, he'd been forced to grovel before sadists and imbeciles, stupid people, as he tried to protect his men. He'd been starved, beaten, enslaved, given the water cure, had his fingernails torn out. He was done negotiating. He hauled back and punched the station official, to the delight of Ken Marvin. The next morning, the train was there, right on time. Early on the morning of September 5th, Louis packed up his diary, the record from Tinker, and his letters from home, and stepped down the barracks ladder for the last time. In the compound, the POWs were congregating in joyful anticipation. Everyone carried what few possessions they had, and the British Commonwealth soldiers held the white boxes bearing the remains of the 60 Aussies who had died in camp. Determined to leave this indecent place with dignity, the men assembled behind flags of their nations. Then together they passed through the camp gate and marched up the road toward wives and sweethearts and children and mom and dad and home. As he walked over the bridge, Louis glanced back. Some of the guards and camp officials stood in the compound watching them go. A few of the sickest POWs remained behind, awaiting transport the next day. Fitzgerald stayed with them, unwilling to leave until the last of his men was liberated. Louis raised his arm and waved the war goodbye. He crossed over the bridge, and the camp passed out of view. Nuetzu was a broken line of Japanese. The few civilian guards and camp staffers who had been killed to them, who had been kind to them, standing alongside the side of the track. Their hands were raised in salute. Whew. And on that note, Louis headed home